So how are you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing good. Thanks, Dana. Yeah, so a lot of the topics that Nick and Marissa talked about, I was sitting here thinking like, oh yeah, I'll show that. So I know Michael later is going to talk about the shared reference point tool, which definitely is one really effective way to get the shared coordinates from civil engineers out to the Revit models for architecture's MEP structural. But the way that and we've adopted here at Smith Group is to take a Revit model and basically create a site model from it. So we've actually developed our own template for civil engineers and landscape architects to use because we do actually do a little bit of Revit modeling ourselves, so we can kind of more accurately show the site in relationship to the building. So for me, the best way to show anything is always to just do a demo. So we're going to give it a go. Live demo here. Sometimes those work out good. Sometimes they have their own struggles. So we'll see what happens here. So talked about the survey. The surveyors, they're the ones who usually establish, what coordinate system you're going to be on. Most likely it's going to be a NAVD 83, which is, a coordinate system set up back in 1983 to kind of get that state plane coordinate system set up. This is a project located in Michigan, and it's just a basic CAD file. The problem that usually happens between Revit and Civil 3D is Civil 3D has its own content that is native to it, and Revit doesn't quite understand it. I'm talking about points and surfaces and then pipe networks. Those are three things that are Civil 3D specific that Revit tends to struggle with. So if you were just to purely link a Civil 3D file from the civil engineer directly into Revit, you're going to get all sorts of warnings. There's going to be a lot of issues with those files. Another thing that isn't great with Revit is the 20-mile radius. So if you linked in that file and there's something hanging out in space, you're going to get a lot of skewing of the visuals when you zoom in and zoom out. And oftentimes you'll know that's an issue when you first link in a CAD file. If it says couldn't be found, it's going to link it center to center. That's bad news. Your file's going to be way off in space and you're going to have some issues in Revit. So always want to be careful with that. So let's talk about the setting up of a file. This one's pretty basic, but there's two ways that you would want to prepare a CAD file for Revit. The first is to run an export. So this is purely in Civil 3D. I know most users are probably Revit users, but I'll just show you what it's like for me on my end. I would come and do an export Civil 3D drawing. It's going to pull up some settings, but basically I just need to tell it where to go. What this export does is, I'm going to go ahead and accept my settings here. So what it's going to do is it's going to delete, or it's going to dumb down all the Civil 3D objects into just plain AutoCAD. So you're going to get rid of all those points. You're going to get rid of the pipe networks and surfaces. It's just going to be dumb AutoCAD line work. And that's what Revit really needs. It doesn't need any of the fancy stuff that you can manipulate in Civil 3D. Once you've done that, most of the time you're going to be good. That is assuming that you don't have things outside of your 20-mile radius, which tends to be an issue sometimes. So the other file that I'm going to be using here today is a layout file. This file I've already coordinated with, since this project's pretty much on that done. I've coordinated with architects, and we've already kind of got the building model. They've exported out for me. I was able to locate it on the site, which is probably one of the first steps that you'll ever want to do, is give an export to the civil engineers so they can understand what that building is. And the number one thing I can always recommend, export with grids. You want your grids turned on. The reason being, as a civil engineer, the building footprint exterior looks great, but early on in the project, you've just used a generic wall. And then as you move on, you're going to start adding in brick, and then inevitably that building keeps expanding just a little bit. So having those building edges as a reference line early on is really troublesome because things expand. So grids, that's something that usually never moves. So I always like to use those in locating my model. With this model here, I'm just going to go ahead now and show you the second way to do it, and that's using a W block. That command is just going to take all the objects that I want to select, and I'll just select the objects that I want, except for that. And it's just going to grab just that. What this does is it ensures that it limits that 20-mile radius to just the objects that I've selected. I can go ahead and save this where I want to. So the W-block command is great to kind of hone in on a 20-mile radius. Export command is one that you'll want to do to dumb down the AutoCAD objects. Sometimes you need to do both. And oftentimes in Revit, if you get errors, you'll know that you've probably got to go that extra step and do the export and W-block. So I'm all done here in Civil 3D. Those are two things that I've done early on is I've exported the survey, which is what I want to start from for the site model, and then the layout, which I like to bring in so I can locate that building where I've already decided in CAD. I'm going to jump over into Revit 2020. This is what the model will look like. And I have a project started out here that I want to just, I've already done the synchronize, saved it. So this is using our civil template that we have created in Revit. You can just use any generic template. All you really need is just a layout plan and some elevations. So within Revit, what we want to do is open out our layout plan, which I got. It's a working one, so I can just add stuff and don't have to worry about annotations or anything. And I'm going to go to the Insert tab. To link in CAD files, you always want to do link CAD. You don't want to do the import for these. And I'm going to go ahead and find that file. So I've saved it here. I'm going to start with my survey. There's some settings that you want to make sure you have set up right away, and that's colors. You can leave it as preserved or you can leave black and white. But this correct lines that are slightly off axis, that's always selected to start. You want to make sure that's unchecked. What that's going to do is in the civil world, we might be close to north and south, but we're not quite there. Revit buildings, they're like almost always on orthogonal grids. If you got a line that's close, if you left that checked, it's going to force the CAD file to skew. We don't like that at all. And then the inserting, initially you want to bring it in origin to origin. We haven't have shared coordinates set up yet, so we're just going to bring that in.
Heather is actually asking if you can show the export again from Civil 3D to AutoCAD. Is there a way to get rid of the 3D topo lines that stay 3D, but everything else flatten? She said she tried to do this the other day, but there's still a bunch of weird things going on with the survey file.
Yeah, so you wanted the survey to be, or the contours to get flattened?
A way for the 3D topo lines to stay 3D, but everything else to be flattened.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's honestly what typically could happen with a CAD file is oftentimes the line work, all the line work's drawn at 0 elevation, but the surface elements such as contours, they're going to hover up high. So as long as the surface style is set up in Civil 3D to show your contours, when you export that, the contours will still be shown. They're just going to be polylines at that point. So they'll have an elevation associated with it. When you bring it into Revit, they'll actually have the true elevation, whereas all the line work will be down at elevation 0.
I'm going to interject here because it's one thing that I've really liked about how you kind of disassociate the 3D topography from the Civil 3D link. That way you can control those separately. So like the line work is one thing, and that's at the flat level, and then the 3D is at a separate link so you can turn things on and off.
Yeah, and we've gone as far in our world as creating 2 files. We've had one that's just line work, and we've had one that's surface elements. That does give you a little bit more control, and I think that might have been a little what Nick was talking about too. All right, so back in Revit, what I got here is now linked in this survey file. What I want to do is I need to move it to put it close to our origin. Now, one thing I want to recommend is when you do this move, always use something that's a known point. Because this is a survey, usually there's a benchmark located on it or a property line. For this one, I have a property boundary edge right here. And that's what I want to set right at my origin point. The reason I do that is that's a known point. I can check it. You can look at the coordinates in Civil 3D, look at the coordinates in Revit, and they're going to be always known. Especially if it's on a benchmark, that's something you can go out in the field and find every single time. So that's a really big key.
Something that you would probably coordinate with the team, or would you just decide on your own?
You pretty much decide on your own. Oftentimes there's going to be 2 or 3 benchmarks that are noted on the survey. You just want to find one that's going to be closest to the building. That way, you have a pretty good reference that's close by.
I always in the past hated moving the civils engineering civil 3D file. Like I just hate, like I wanted to leave it where it was. And then that was like where my point was. So I'm really happy that you do that, but I don't have to. But can you talk to a little bit why maybe that's not set up in civil 3D and why we're doing that in Revit? Is it just because of the translation between the points, I guess?
Yeah, it's the coordinate translation between a shared coordinate system and the project coordinate system. It does need to make a translation in Revit versus Civil 3D. It's just always real world coordinates. When I link in this file here, it was dumb to start. I brought it in origin to origin. It had no data into it. So that's where we need to move it initially. After you set up the shared coordinates, that's when you never want to move the file. It should be reliant upon the shared coordinates then.
And just to be clear, this is typical, like what you're setting up now would be kind of what Nick was referencing to before, kind of that site specific Revit file that everybody's going to link to establish that.
And really you could, depending on what you're trying to do, you can actually set the shared coordinates up before you bring the Civil 3D file in. And what that does is rather than manually or auto placing it, you can actually pick auto by shared coordinates. And what that'll do is it'll actually align the two coordinate systems between Civil 3D and Revit. And that's how Revit finally learns the true GIS coordinate system. That's the only way that it'll know, hey, it's this NAD 83, whichever state plane it is. So,
yeah, so there's multiple ways to get to this end solution. The key is just doing it early on in your project. You want to make sure you get that set up early. It just makes life a lot easier. Exports coming down from Revit for civil engineers. We can just bring it in on 000. Same thing. You can bring in the updated layout file into Revit later, and it's going to drop in where we want it to. So setting it up early is the biggest key. There's a lot of different ways. I know Michael's going to show another way too. But this site model that we're talking about right now, this is a great use for campus. It's going to have its shared coordinates set up. I can link in 10, 20, 30 architectural models. Probably don't want to go to a bunch, but you can link them in, locate them on the site. If you got a real nice CAD background, you can locate them in, and then everything's on the same shared coordinate system. It's really great for that.
And when you say a known point, do you mean something existing? Like you said that the point that you, I guess that's a property line that you point would be easy to be found, but would maybe like a corner of an existing building be something that you'd want to, like, you know, what are some maybe examples of a point that you would select?
Yeah, worst case scenario, building corner, but not all buildings sometimes last, especially if it's an old one. You know, those could get moved. And oftentimes too, if you got a survey stake, trying to go up against a building, you're never going to get exactly there because the width of the rod that you're using is always going to be an effect. So benchmarks are the best that you can use. Those are pretty much always going to be used on a survey. It's called out somewhere, or control point. Those are two different things that surveyors always are going to be setting up initially in their survey. That way they can be easily replicated by another surveyor when they're going out there to stake things in the field. So those are the two that you want to look for, control points or benchmarks. Each have record data that you can go back to the surveyor to find. Okay, so I'll jump into kind of getting those coordinates, and then we can probably jump on into Michael. But so right now, just showing these coordinates here, if I click on the project base point or the survey point, they all have 000 set to it. So what I got to do now that I've brought in my model here, or the survey model, is acquire the coordinates. So to do that, you go to the Manage tab, and then there's the coordinates here. That's where you select Acquire Coordinates. So this is, all I'm doing is, sorry, I went to a little quick, but it had asked to select a link. I click the CAD file, and it happens automatically. If I click this point now, there we go. We have a northing and an easting that are set up to match our real world coordinates. You'll note now though that the elevation is at 0. So this is that one thing that Nick had talked about earlier, to make sure you're coordinating with the civil engineer to set up that Z. You know, you can get close, but you're never going to know it exactly until the grading's been done on the civil side. So the second step that you'd want to do to kind of establish that Z for a file like this is jump over into an elevation view. And here I have my building first floor. That's where it was brought in. That's just the template that we have set up. But you can establish that Z. You can do it one of two ways. You can move the building floor up, or you can use another handy tool that Revit's got built in, and that is to relocate the project. So if I went to position, relocate project, I'm just going to select down here, and I know that I set this building at 604. If you do that, it's going to move the entire site up 604 feet. So zooming out, there we go. Now my building first floor is at elevation 604. So if I was to link in the architectural Revit model, which would be my next step in all of this, it's going to come in at the right elevation that I want it to. So I'm going to do 2 quick links, and then we can move on. So I'm going to link in now that layout file that I prepared before. Now that I have a shared coordinate system, I can set this now to by shared coordinates, link it in, and then it's going to be able to drop in correctly. So if you have any updates down the line up from the engineers that you need to show in your Revit backgrounds, you link that in. It does pop up this error sometimes, but you click OK and it drops in where it wants to. I think that's where Nick was talking about that initial input with the coordinate systems being for Revit to finally recognize it. Doing it this way, it knows it's there. It just isn't quite sure how to figure it out, but it gets it right in the end. So there we go. And then now I'm just going to turn off my survey so that we're just seeing the layout. The last step that you'd want to do is bring in your Revit model. So I'm going to go ahead and link that in. And Nick, I see you might want to add on while I'm doing this. You can certainly chime in.
Well, I was going to ask you to go back because there's 2 things about what you're showing that I'd like to point out to people. One of them is a change that wasn't really well noted in Revit. I think it was 2020. But if you select your project base point, a lot of people are like, oh, if I enter the values here, I can enter it and move it into the right place. When they got rid of pinning and unpinning the project base point, if you enter values into the parameters, it will actually move the project base point away from the internal origin. And that's a little catch that a lot of people don't know about. And you can really get yourself into problems very easily doing that.
So the clip is gone?
Clip is gone. Yeah. You can clip and unclip the shared, the survey point. You cannot clip and unclip the project base point after 2020. And so now if, so you've got the survey point.
Yep.
So you can clip and unclip that, but the project base point, you don't have a clip anymore. And so if you enter the...
Honestly, that makes me more confused.
It does. Well, they did it on a reason, but my issue with it is they got rid of that, but you can still manually type in the values, which moves the project base point away from the internal origin. And, you know, we know that we can't build away from the internal origin because that causes problems. And then the other thing that I like to point out, if you could go back to your elevation,
yep.
These are little nitpicky things that I have with Revit. Go ahead and select one of your levels and go to the type properties of that level. So right here, the elevation base, it says survey point. That's not the survey point.
All the time.
It's not the survey point. It is your shared coordinates. Now the project base point is sort of based off the project base point location, the height of that. But where it says survey point, it is not based off of where in the z-axis the survey point is. It could care less where the z-axis is the survey point. And I think that's one of the key confusion parts of where people think the survey point's an origin, and it's not. That your survey point, you can move that, and these elevation numbers will not change. So,
all right, we're running a little bit on short on time. It's okay. This is a wonderful conversation, and I love it. But before we jump to Michael, we do have a few questions. So Sarah asks, even though your CAD file you refer to as being dumbed down, you can still bring in the coordinates. So you still acquired the coordinates from it.
Yeah, all the actual like horizontal line work is going to be set. It's just getting rid of
like the real life coordinates are still set within the file.
Yeah, all the line work's going to be good. It's stripping the Civil 3D content.
And Heather asks, it looked like before you relocated your project using the position tool, your sea level was set to -15 feet. Is that just the way our template, like what?
Yeah, that's just the way our template's set up because our building floor is where I really want the building to come in. So I had that initially set at 0. The step that I do actually next is then after I have that first floor set, I'd bring this down to 0 And then I do all of my modeling off a survey point or the sea level. So in this beautiful model over here, I end up setting all my floors and everything to sea level so I can type in true elevations to get it all set up.
Interesting. Okay. Another question, how critical are import units when importing civil CAD files?
Very, very critical.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you always set that. For us, we're using foot. I know in Canada metric, so you want to make sure you're using the right units going back and forth.
And that's usually when I'm teaching it, that's really the only time that I'm messing with that units function when I'm importing CAD is when I'm using civil files. So always make sure that you're using the right imports. Absolutely. And then can you specify coordinates at a point?
In the Revit model?
Yes, I guess so. Heather
Yeah, I mean,
is
you can
asking.
annotate if that's what the question was. So you can do a spot coordinate and yeah, you can check it. And there we go. We got actual points. So you can, in your modeling, show those building corners with coordinates.
And would that be the same as entering the data? I
I
feel
think
like it
entering
didn't
the
work.
data would be these. I might be getting the question wrong.
Okay. Maybe we'll have Heather jump in later and ask some questions.
Yeah.
Because I love Heather and she obviously brings some wonderful perspective. So
I think what the answer is when you moved the CAD file and then you acquired the coordinates, that's very similar as the same as if you went to manage and specify coordinates at point. Because when you acquired it from the CAD file, it got the coordinates at the internal origin and at the project base point and filled that data in. So specify coordinates at point is just another way of accomplishing the same thing.
awesome.